Frank had been delivering our mail for 15 years. His announcement at the block party exposed a postal conspiracy that had been affecting our entire neighborhood. The whole thing started on a typical Saturday afternoon in late September. Our neighborhood association had organized this block party, the kind where everyone drags their folding tables out to the street and tries to make small talk with people they've been waving at for years but never actually spoken to. I was standing by the dessert table, trying to decide between 3 different versions of chocolate chip cookies, when I noticed Frank walking up the street. Now, seeing Frank on a Saturday was weird enough. He's our mail carrier, and I'd gotten used to his routine over the years. Monday through Friday, like clockwork, he'd come down our street around 2 p.m., always wearing that same postal uniform, always with that friendly nod when he saw me watering my plants or bringing in groceries. But here he was on a weekend, in civilian clothes, looking more serious than I'd ever seen him. The thing about Frank is that he's always been this steady presence in our neighborhood. When I moved here 8 years ago, he was already established as part of the community fabric. He knew everyone's names, remembered when kids went off to college, asked about sick relatives. The kind of guy who made you feel like your little corner of the world actually mattered to someone. So when he walked straight to the middle of our impromptu street gathering and cleared his throat like he had something important to say, everyone naturally turned to listen. The conversations died down. Kids stopped running around with their sidewalk chalk. Even the neighbor's dog seemed to sense something was up. Frank looked around at all of us gathered there, maybe 30 people total, ranging from the young couple who just moved in last month to the elderly woman who'd lived on the street longer than anyone could remember. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking slightly as he pulled out a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He started talking, and what came out of his mouth made my blood run cold. Frank confessed that he had been deliberately misdelivering our mail for years. Not just simple mistakes, we all know those happen, but intentional, systematic misdelivery as part of what he called his personal investigation into our lives. He said he'd been opening our letters, reading our personal correspondence, learning our secrets. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt my stomach drop as I processed what he was saying. All those times I'd wondered why important mail seemed to arrive late or not at all. The credit card statements that showed up at random times. The birthday cards from my sister that seemed to take forever to reach me. The package from my mom that arrived opened and retaped. Frank kept talking, his voice getting stronger as he went on. He detailed how he'd steam open envelopes, read everything inside, then carefully reseal them before delivering them to random houses in the neighborhood. He talked about intercepting packages, opening them in his truck, examining the contents before deciding where they should actually go. He even admitted to stealing checks, not cashing them, he emphasized, but holding on to them, studying them, learning about our financial situations. The crowd was getting restless. I could see the anger building on people's faces. The woman next to me was clutching her phone, probably already looking up the number for postal inspectors. Someone behind me was muttering about federal crimes and lawsuits. The young father from 2 houses down was pacing back and forth, clearly trying to control his temper. Frank seemed to sense the mood shifting. He held up his hands and said he had more to tell us, that we needed to hear the whole story before we made any calls. He reached into a large canvas bag he'd brought with him and started pulling out stacks of mail. Hundreds of pieces, all neatly organized and tied with rubber bands. This is where things took a turn I never saw coming. Frank started sorting through the mail, calling out addresses. Every piece was correctly addressed to houses on our street. But instead of just handing them over, he began explaining what each stack represented. Birthday cards for the elderly woman at the end of the street, dozens of them. Care packages from family members across the country. Letters from grandchildren, great-grandchildren, old friends who'd moved away. Slowly, the real story emerged. Frank hadn't been stealing our mail for his own benefit or out of some creepy desire to invade our privacy. He'd been orchestrating something completely different, something that had been months in the planning. The elderly woman he was talking about, she lived in the last house on our street, the one with the perfectly maintained garden but drawn curtains. I'd seen her occasionally, always alone, always quiet. She'd lost her husband 2 years ago, and since then, she'd become increasingly isolated. Frank had noticed that her mail had dwindled to almost nothing. Just bills and advertisements, the lonely mail of someone who'd been forgotten by the world. So Frank had started reaching out. Not officially, not through any postal service program, but on his own time, using his own resources. He tracked down her scattered family members, old friends, former neighbors who'd moved away. He'd contacted them, explained the situation, and asked them to send cards, letters, anything that might brighten her day. The response had been overwhelming. Family members who'd lost touch started sending regular letters. Old friends began mailing care packages. Even strangers who heard about the situation through word of mouth started contributing. Frank had been collecting all of this mail for months, waiting for the right moment to deliver it all at once. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. Frank had been doing this for other people in the neighborhood too. Not just the elderly woman, but anyone he'd noticed seemed to be going through a hard time. The single mom who'd been struggling since her divorce. The teenager whose parents had been fighting constantly. The retired man who'd been battling health issues. Frank had been playing Postal Cupid, connecting people who needed support with others who were willing to provide it. He'd been facilitating anonymous acts of kindness, coordinating care packages, even arranging for surprise deliveries of flowers and homemade treats. All of this happening right under our noses, and none of us had any idea. The mood in the crowd shifted again, but this time in a completely different direction. The anger was replaced by something else. Amazement, maybe, or gratitude. People started looking at each other differently, realizing that Frank had been weaving connections between us that we'd never known existed. But Frank wasn't done yet. He had one more revelation that would change everything. Date 1. The next morning, I woke up thinking about everything Frank had told us. The block party had ended with a mixture of emotions, relief, gratitude, and a strange sense of community that I'd never felt before. But there was something nagging at me about Frank's story. Something didn't quite add up. I'd been living on the street for 8 years, and I pride myself on being observant. I notice things when new people move in, when someone's routine changes, when something seems off. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized there were details in Frank's confession that didn't match what I'd actually experienced. For instance, Frank had mentioned holding on to my sister's birthday cards, but I'd received every single one of them on time. He'd talked about intercepting packages, but I'd never had a package go missing. The credit card statements he claimed to have misdelivered had actually arrived exactly when they were supposed to. I started making a mental list of all the mail issues I'd actually experienced over the years, and they were surprisingly few. A couple of letters that arrived a day late, maybe a magazine that showed up at the wrong house once. Nothing that couldn't be explained by normal postal service hiccups. Around noon, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. I wanted to see if I could spot any obvious signs of the mail conspiracy Frank had described. What I found instead was something entirely different. I ran into the young mother from 3 houses down. She was in her front yard, planting flowers, and she looked happier than I'd seen her in months. When I asked how she was doing, she mentioned that she'd been receiving the most wonderful anonymous care packages recently. Little things, homemade cookies, tea bags, small toys for her kids. No return address, no explanation, just kindness showing up in her mailbox. Then I talked to the teenager whose parents had been going through a rough patch. He told me about the college brochures and scholarship information that had been arriving in his mailbox, all from schools he'd never contacted. Someone had been researching opportunities for him, sending him resources to help plan his future. The elderly woman at the end of the street was outside tending her garden, which was unusual. When I walked by, she waved and mentioned that she'd been having the most interesting correspondence with old friends lately. People she hadn't heard from in years had been reaching out, sharing memories, making plans to visit. It was becoming clear that Frank had been telling the truth about orchestrating these acts of kindness. But the more I learned, the more I realized that his confession at the block party had been carefully constructed. He'd made it sound like he'd been doing something wrong, something that required confession and forgiveness. But everything he'd actually done had been positive, helpful, connecting. That evening, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I knocked on Frank's door. Frank lived in a small apartment complex about 10 minutes from our neighborhood. When he answered the door, he looked tired but not surprised to see me. He invited me in, and we sat in his modest living room, surrounded by postal service commendations and neighborhood photos. I asked him directly why he'd made his good deeds sound like crimes, why he'd scared everyone before revealing the truth, why he'd chosen to frame his kindness as a confession. Frank was quiet for a long moment, then he started talking about his own life. He'd been a mail carrier for over 20 years, he said. He'd seen neighborhoods change, families grow up, people move away. He'd watched communities slowly disconnect from each other, people becoming more isolated despite living so close together. He'd started small, just making sure that important mail got delivered properly, taking extra care with packages that looked like they might be gifts. But over time, he'd begun to see patterns. He'd notice when someone's mail indicated they were struggling financially, or when a house stopped receiving personal letters, or when medical bills suggested someone was dealing with health issues. Frank had decided to use his unique position to help, but he'd been doing it secretly for years. The confession at the block party hadn't been about admitting to crimes. It had been about revealing the extent of his involvement in our community. He'd been afraid that if people knew how much he'd been orchestrating behind the scenes, they'd feel manipulated or invaded. But there was something else. Frank told me that he'd been planning to retire soon, and he'd been worried about what would happen to all the connections he'd been maintaining. He'd been looking for a way to make the community aware of what was possible, to inspire people to continue the work he'd been doing. The fake confession had been his way of shocking people into paying attention, then showing them what community support could look like. He'd wanted to demonstrate that the mail system could be a tool for connection, not just delivery. As Frank was explaining all of this, I started to understand something bigger. The mail issues I'd been thinking about that morning, they hadn't been random postal problems. They'd been Frank's way of testing the waters, seeing how people responded to small disruptions, measuring the community's readiness for his larger plan. But Frank had one more surprise for me. He pulled out a thick folder filled with letters and forms, applications for a community outreach program he'd been developing with the Postal Service. A legitimate, official way to use mail delivery as a tool for neighborhood support and connection. Frank had been working for months to create a program that would allow mail carriers to identify community members who might benefit from additional support, then coordinate with local organizations and volunteers to provide that support. The program would be completely transparent, entirely voluntary, and focused on building genuine community connections. The confession at the block party had been his way of introducing the idea, showing people what was possible, and gauging their interest in participating. He'd been hoping that, by demonstrating the positive impact of his unofficial efforts, he could build support for making them official. I left Frank's apartment that night with a completely different understanding of what had happened at the block party. Frank hadn't been confessing to crimes. He'd been proposing a revolution in how neighborhoods could support each other. Update 2. The next few weeks were unlike anything I'd ever experienced in our neighborhood. Word of Frank's community outreach program spread quickly, and the response was overwhelming. People who had barely spoken to each other before were suddenly collaborating on care packages and support networks. The young mother I'd talked to started organizing a childcare swap with other parents on the street. The teenager who'd been receiving college information began tutoring younger kids in the neighborhood. The elderly woman at the end of the street became the unofficial coordinator for a meal delivery system for anyone who was sick or struggling. But the most surprising development was how quickly people began to open up about their own struggles and needs. Frank's revelation had somehow created a safe space for vulnerability in our community. People started sharing stories they'd been keeping private for years. I learned that the quiet couple in the blue house had been dealing with fertility issues for years and had been feeling isolated and ashamed. The woman who always seemed to have everything together had been struggling with anxiety since her mother's death. The man who worked from home had been battling depression and had been desperately lonely. Frank's program was officially approved by the Postal Service 3 weeks after the block party. The local office was so impressed with the preliminary results that they decided to use our neighborhood as a pilot program for a larger initiative. Frank would continue as our mail carrier, but now he'd also be a community liaison, with official support and resources. The program worked like this. Community members could voluntarily participate by filling out a simple form indicating their willingness to give or receive support. Frank would use his daily route to identify opportunities for connection, someone who might benefit from a meal delivery, a family that could use help with yard work, an elderly person who would enjoy regular visits. The program maintained strict privacy protections. Frank couldn't share personal information or discuss people's mail contents, but he could facilitate connections between people who had indicated they wanted to help and those who had expressed a need for support. Within a month, our neighborhood had transformed into something I'd never seen before. The informal networks that had been building since the block party became more organized and sustainable. People were checking on each other regularly, sharing resources, celebrating successes together. The elderly woman at the end of the street, who had been the original inspiration for Frank's efforts, became the heart of the community. Her house became a regular gathering place for informal coffee hours and impromptu celebrations. She'd gone from being isolated and forgotten to being the center of a thriving social network. But the most unexpected development came when Frank approached me about 6 weeks after the block party. He'd been selected to present our neighborhood's program at a national postal service conference, and he wanted me to come with him to represent the community perspective. I'd never thought of myself as a community leader, but Frank convinced me that my experience as someone who'd been initially skeptical but ultimately supportive made me a valuable voice for the program. He wanted me to help explain how the program had worked from a resident's perspective. The conference was held in Washington, D.C., and it was my first time seeing how postal service operations worked on a national level. Frank's presentation was scheduled for the final day, and he'd prepared a comprehensive overview of our pilot program's results. The statistics were impressive. Community engagement had increased by over 300%. Requests for social services had decreased by 40%. Reported feelings of isolation and loneliness had dropped significantly. Even property values had started to increase as the neighborhood became more desirable. But the most powerful part of Frank's presentation wasn't the numbers. It was the stories. He told the audience about the elderly woman who'd gone from receiving only bills to coordinating community meals. About the teenager who'd discovered his passion for teaching through tutoring younger kids. About the young mother who'd built a support network that had helped her through her divorce. Frank's presentation was well received, but what happened afterward was completely unexpected. Representatives from postal services in other countries approached him about implementing similar programs internationally. Community organizations from across the United States wanted to partner with the Postal Service to develop their own versions of the program. Frank had accidentally created something much bigger than a neighborhood support network. He'd developed a model for using existing infrastructure to build community connections on a massive scale. The conference organizers asked Frank to stay an extra day to participate in planning sessions for a national rollout of the program. They wanted to use our neighborhood as a training site for mail carriers from across the country who would be implementing similar programs in their own communities. When Frank and I returned home, we found that our neighborhood had continued to evolve even in our absence. The community members had organized themselves into working groups focused on different aspects of support meals, transportation, childcare, elderly care, and youth mentoring. What had started as Frank's secret mission to help one isolated elderly woman had become a comprehensive community support system that was attracting attention from researchers, policymakers, and community organizers from around the world. But the most meaningful moment came when I was walking home from the grocery store one evening and saw Frank delivering mail to the house across the street. It was the same routine I'd watched for years, Frank walking from house to house, taking his time, checking in with people along the way. The difference was that now I understood what I was really seeing. Frank wasn't just delivering mail. He was maintaining the connections that held our community together. Every delivery was an opportunity to check on someone's well-being, to facilitate a connection, to identify a need or an opportunity to help. I realized that Frank had been doing this work all along, long before the official program existed. The block party confession, the community outreach program, the national recognition, all of that had just been a way to make visible the work that mail carriers like Frank had been doing quietly for years. Final update. 6 months after the block party that changed everything, I was asked to write an article about our experience for a national magazine. The assignment forced me to reflect on how dramatically my life had changed since that September afternoon when Frank made his surprising announcement. The most obvious changes were in the neighborhood itself. Our street had become a model for community engagement that was being studied by urban planners and social scientists. The pilot program had been so successful that it was being expanded to over 100 neighborhoods across the country. But the deeper changes were in how I understood my own role in the community. Before Frank's revelation, I'd been a polite but distant neighbor. I'd lived on the street for 8 years without really knowing the people around me. I'd been content to keep to myself, to maintain friendly but superficial relationships with the people who lived closest to me. Frank's program had shown me that community isn't something that happens naturally. It's something that requires intention, effort, and courage. Someone has to be willing to reach out first, to take risks, to be vulnerable. Frank had been doing that work for years, and his example had inspired others to do the same. The article assignment also gave me a chance to follow up with the people whose lives had been most dramatically affected by Frank's efforts. The elderly woman at the end of the street had become a regional coordinator for isolated seniors, helping to connect them with support networks in their own communities. She'd gone from being someone who was forgotten to someone who was actively working to make sure others weren't forgotten. The young mother had started a nonprofit organization focused on supporting single parents. She'd used the network of support she'd built in our neighborhood as a model for creating similar networks in other communities. The skills she'd developed coordinating childcare swaps and meal deliveries had translated into a career in community organizing. The teenager who'd been receiving college information had graduated early and was studying urban planning with a focus on community development. He'd already been accepted to a prestigious graduate program where he planned to research the role of infrastructure in building social connections. Frank himself had been promoted to a regional position where he was responsible for training mail carriers across the state in community engagement techniques. He'd also been invited to speak at conferences around the world about the intersection of public service and community building. But the most significant change was in how I understood the concept of service. Frank had shown me that service isn't just about helping people when they ask for help. It's about paying attention to what people need and finding creative ways to meet those needs. Frank had been serving our community for years before anyone recognized it. He'd been using his position as a mail carrier to facilitate connections, provide support, and build relationships. He'd been doing the work of community building quietly, consistently, and without recognition. The block party confession had been Frank's way of making that service visible, but more importantly, it had been his way of inspiring others to find their own ways to serve. He'd shown us that community building isn't the responsibility of professionals or organizations. It's something that ordinary people can do in their ordinary lives. As I finished writing the article, I realized that Frank's most important contribution wasn't the program he'd created or the recognition he'd received. It was the example he'd set of paying attention to the people around him and finding ways to make their lives better. The article was published 3 months later, and it generated more response than I'd expected. Readers from around the country wrote to share their own stories of community building and to ask for advice about starting similar programs in their own neighborhoods. But the most meaningful response came from Frank himself. He wrote me a letter delivered by hand, of course, thanking me for helping to tell the story of what had happened in our neighborhood. He said that seeing the story in print had helped him understand the full impact of what he'd been doing. Frank's letter ended with a simple observation that has stayed with me ever since. He wrote that he'd learned that the most powerful tool for building community isn't technology or programs or policies. It's paying attention to the people around you and caring enough to act on what you notice. Looking back now, I understand that Frank's confession at the block party wasn't really about mail delivery at all. It was about the power of one person to change an entire community by choosing to pay attention, to care, and to act. Frank had been doing that work for years, and his example had inspired dozens of other people to do the same. Our neighborhood had been transformed not by any single dramatic action, but by the accumulation of small, consistent acts of attention and care. Frank had shown us that building community is less about grand gestures and more about showing up consistently, paying attention to what people need, and finding creative ways to help. The program that grew out of Frank's work continues to expand, but the real legacy of that September block party is simpler and more profound. Frank had shown us that every person has the power to strengthen their community by choosing to pay attention to the people around them and finding ways to serve. That realization changed not just our neighborhood, but the way I understand my own responsibility to the community I'm part of. Frank's example showed me that service isn't something you do in addition to your regular life. It's a way of approaching your regular life with intention and care. The mail still comes every day at 2 p.m., and Frank still delivers it with the same attention and care he's always shown. The difference is that now we all understand what we're really seeing when we watch him work. We're watching someone who has chosen to use his ordinary job as a tool for building community, one delivery at a time.